The moral law is eternal. Granted, it was mostly implicit prior to the giving of the law to Moses. It was mostly implicit prior to the giving of the law to Moses. But it was always understood. There are a few commands given before the fall. The command to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. The Sabbath command implied by God's pattern of working 6 days and resting on the seventh. And the command to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But even though other commands weren't explicitly spelled out, they still existed. The law, do not murder, has always existed. That law did not come into existence in Genesis 9. Moses codified the law. He wrote it down, but his codification of the moral law does not mean the moral law began when God gave Moses the Ten Commandments. The moral law has always existed. Because the moral law is eternal, that means all the New Testament laws are a part of it. The New Testament law is part of it. We're not making a distinction here in saying that the moral law is only in the Old Testament or only in the New. Every law, both Old and New Testament, that Christians are still required to obey today, is part of the eternal, unchanging moral law of God. So a command in the New Testament, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is part of the moral law, just like the law, you shall not murder. And when we say that the moral law is eternal, we are essentially just reaching the logical conclusion that necessarily follows from the fact that God is eternal and unchanging. The law reflects the righteous character of God, and if God is eternal, and if God is immutable or unchanging, then it necessarily follows that the moral law is eternal. The only way it could not be eternal is if God is not eternal, or if God changes. God does not change, God is eternal, and so that law, which is simply an extension or reflection of his eternal, unchanging righteousness, justice, goodness, holiness, that law is eternal as well. How did people know the moral law before it was codified under Moses? Theologians speak of two ways that God makes himself and his will known to his creatures. One way is special revelation, what we call now the Bible or the Scriptures. God has put it all in writing for us, and it is a great blessing that he has revealed himself to us in this way, and especially in these last days through his Son. The other way that God reveals himself is through general revelation, through his works of creation and providence. Through God's works of creation and providence. We learn about God by studying what he has made, and we learn about God by studying what he does with what he has made, his works of providence. He didn't just make it, he is now governing it, ruling it, and everything that happens or does not happen teaches us something about the nature of God. It's obviously much better to have the Bible, this special revelation from the Lord, where he speaks to us and has his words inscripturated by prophets and apostles, but we can certainly learn a great deal about God by studying his works. As Psalm 19 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. We can't learn about God everything we need to know from creation, but we can learn a lot. The key passages in the Bible on this doctrine of general revelation are found in the book of Romans, chapters 1 and 2. This is what Paul says in Romans 1. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. What Paul is saying here is that, granted, not everyone has a knowledge of the Bible, but everyone still has a knowledge of God. And there is a great deal that may be known about God, even by those who have never even heard of the Scriptures. And not just can be known, it is known by them. It's plain to them, because God has made it plain. For since God made the world from the very beginning, a lot of God's attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So sinners look at what God has made, and they learn about God. And indeed, they learn so much about him and his law, specifically the moral law we're talking about here, as to render them without excuse. No one can die and go before God and say, I didn't know. I didn't know who you are. I didn't know what you required of me. Paul says, oh no, no one is going to be able to claim that or plead that before the judgment seat of Christ. Everyone will have to admit, yes, I knew that you existed, Lord. And not just, I didn't just know you existed, I actually knew what you required of me. I had an adequate knowledge of the moral law such that you, Lord, can now legitimately say to me that I have no excuse. I am without excuse. I knew your standard and I did not live up to it. And continuing this idea of general revelation in Romans chapter 2, Paul says this, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law, meaning they don't have the scriptures, special revelation, they don't have the Mosaic law, do by nature things required by the law, so they still have some sense of morality and right and wrong, and they often obey the law even if they've never actually heard of the Bible, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. Since they show that the requirements of the law are written in their hearts. Their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. We learn about God and about the moral law of God by studying his creation, and that part of the creation that most especially teaches about God is man. Man alone is made in the image of God. And so we learn about the moral law from everything God has made, but especially from the study of man. We can study ourselves, our own conscience, our own awareness of right or wrong. And it's true that sin has corrupted our conscience and our mind, our ability to understand our own awareness of right and wrong. But nevertheless, although sin has marred the image of God in man, it has not obliterated it. And so simply in the study of ourselves, most especially, as well as the rest of creation, we learn the requirements of the law. They are written on our heart. The requirements of the law are written on our hearts. And again, because of this, we are without excuse. No one can go before God and say, I didn't know. We say that general revelation is enough to damn us, but not enough to save us. It teaches us the bad news, that God is holy, and that we are incapable of reaching his standards. But general revelation does not teach us the good news, that God has provided in his Son a God-man mediator to redeem those who do not keep the law, which, of course, is everybody. But the main point here is that the moral law is eternal, and these passages in Romans show that. From the very beginning, from the creation of the world, all men have been able to learn the moral law, know it, just from what God has made. And this would only be possible, of course, if the moral law has always existed. It is because the moral law is eternal that God can say the following about Abraham in Genesis 26, verses 4 and 5. Speaking to Isaac, God says, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands. And through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept to my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws. God says Abraham obeyed my laws, using language that is normally reserved for the Mosaic law. How can Moses write this, that Abraham obeyed God's laws before the laws were given? Because the moral law, is eternal. Even though it had not been codified, it hadn't been put in writing yet, made part of the formal terms of the covenant. Nevertheless, the moral laws always existed, and whatever this means exactly, that's what this is talking about. Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws. And God can say this about Abraham because the moral law is eternal. Second of all, it's because the moral law is eternal that James chapter 2, verse 10 teaches us that every law is contained in every other law. James 2, verse 10, whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. Every law is contained in every other law. Every law is contained in every other law. And it is a sobering exercise to look at one specific law, consider what it means to break that, the law do not murder, for example, and realize that in breaking that law, you're actually breaking every other law as well. The act of murder breaks the first commandment, well, no other gods before me, and it breaks the seventh commandment about not committing adultery, and it breaks the 10th commandment about not coveting. Whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. How is this possible? Even just that one command back in Genesis 2, that we are not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That one law contained every other law in the moral law as well. Every law is contained in every other law. He who breaks one law is guilty of breaking them all. And finally, it's because the moral law is eternal that there is no need for the New Testament to repeat laws from... There's no need for the New Testament... No need for the New Testament to repeat anything. The New Testament does repeat many of the laws from the Old Testament, but it doesn't have to. It's not like we look at the New Testament and say, well, the law against bestiality is never repeated, and therefore bestiality is okay. No, God's moral law is eternal. It is unchanging. And whether we learn about it from the Old Testament or New Testament, is it all part of the one eternal, unchanging moral law of God, the law by which we will be judged, the law that Christ perfectly kept, that his righteousness might be credited to us lawbreakers. Praise God for his law. May we make right use of it.